After months of seeing rumors and speculation, I finally have my hands on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. And what better time to make a video on it than on my vacation. Now, in all seriousness, I'm actually here in Japan to attend the Formula One Grand Prix over at Suzuka Circuit, which I figured, since it coincided with the release of this phone, that it would be the perfect backdrop to test it out. This isn't going to be the most comprehensive impressions video out there, since there are plenty on YouTube that exist already and run the gamut pretty well. Rather, I want to focus the conversation on stuff that stood out to me using this phone over the weekend. The positives, the negatives, and some long-term concerns that I have with this device. Let's jump right in. First and foremost, I want to talk about the design. It's not the biggest leap compared to the 14 Pro from last year, but I think it still looks striking, especially in this natural titanium colorway. Personally, I like it more than the other colors, but probably more important than what your personal preference is the fact that, yes, we actually have titanium surrounding the phone this year. Apple claims that between this and the aluminum chassis inside, that you overall get a lighter phone. And compared to the 14 Pro, it actually does feel considerably lighter. On paper, the delta is said to be around 0.7 grams, which honestly doesn't seem like a whole lot when you're just looking at the numbers, but trust me, in the hands, you definitely feel it. The lighter center of gravity makes the phone easier to hold, which is also helped by the fact that this year, the frame is a little more rounded. But I also like that it manages to keep a fairly square profile, which is a great balance between aesthetic but also comfort. But of course, at the end of the day, it looks like any other iPhone, which is to say pretty safe, but also tried and true, and I still like this design a lot. Looking around the phone, there are a few other changes that I want to talk about. For example, there's the action button, which replaces the mute switch that has been on the iPhone forever until this point. And I have mine set to open up the camera and also to take a shot, which is really neat, though I still haven't built the muscle memory to remember that it's a thing. I don't have any doubts that the action button will be useful for me in the future, but perhaps what I might do is play around with the shortcuts function to find something that I'll actually want to use on a regular basis. But for now, I just have it set to open up my camera, but also the action button does have pretty natural placement for where you'd expect a shutter button to be on, say, a point and shoot. So that's kind of neat, even though the volume buttons already acted as a shutter button on the other phones. Speaking of the shutter, whenever I go to take a photo, even though the phone is on silent, the shutter sound still goes off. And that's because I had to buy a Japanese market iPhone 15 Pro Max. The phone came out when I was in the country and I needed to do my coverage on it. And so I did what I had to do and bought the phone here. If you guys didn't already know, Japan has privacy laws where smartphones have shutter sounds so that people know when you decide to take photos in the bathroom and places like that. But the good thing about the iPhone, at least as far as what I've read, and I'll certainly find out when I get back home, is that for the past couple of iPhones, Apple has actually made it so that if you put an international SIM and your phone isn't in Japan, you can actually take photos silently when your phone is set to silent. What is, however, my favorite thing about buying a Japanese model phone is that this one has a SIM card slot. Since the iPhone 14, Apple has completely done away with SIM card slots on US model phones and completely relying on eSIM for cellular connectivity. It's been fine for me because I've been using eSIM for years, but when I travel abroad, it's still nice to have the option of swapping out physical SIM cards. And it's not like there's much of a compromise here either. I can still put multiple eSIMs as well as any SIM card I want into the phone and still dual wield two services at a time, regardless of which one I'm using. So in this sense, I get the best of both worlds. Looking at the bottom of this iPhone 15 Pro Max, and you will see the biggest change by far this year. and that is the switch to USB Type-C. This has been a long time coming for us iPhone users. Not only will we get to use the same cable that's on every other device, which should make our everyday carries a lot more simple, but also for those of us that use the Pro model iPhones to do professional things like take a lot of photos and shoot a lot of video for work, having USB 3.1 Gen 2 with 10 gigabit transfer speeds will make offloading media a cinch. In fact, when I was shooting a lot of ProRes video and raw photos at Suzuka Circuit over the F1 weekend, it was pretty handy to plug in my Samsung external SSD, offload like 90 gigs worth of stuff, and have it be done in less than 10 minutes. Absolutely essential, especially considering the fact that I had to buy a 256 gig iPhone 15 Pro Max, which is not nearly enough storage to do all of the things that I want to do. But with an external drive, the possibilities are now endless, even for my tiny storage iPhone. Also, as a side note, Apple pretty much lets you do anything with this USB-C port. You can plug in a 4-port hub, for example, and say plug power into one port, plug in your USB audio from like my DJI microphone into another, and also plug in the SSD, and it'll all work totally fine. I kind of just assumed that the port would be pretty limited on how much you could do simultaneously with it, but it doesn't seem like there's a limit apart from bandwidth, but I certainly haven't hit that yet. So kudos to Apple for actually doing this USB-C thing right. All right, so slight scene change. I'm back here in the studio editing the iPhone video as we speak. And I think it's a perfect opportunity to talk about the cameras now that I've spent a little more time taking a look at the photos and videos that I shot. If we're talking about stills, compared to last year, I honestly can't really notice that much of a difference to my eye. But all of this to say that the photos still look great, especially while shooting with that main 48 megapixel sensor, and even better when shooting RAW. Probably the biggest change this year comes with the iPhone 15 Pro Max with its 5x telephoto lens, which is roughly equivalent to 120 millimeters in focal length. This was really nice while spectating the F1 race, since I wasn't super close to the track, but was still able to get reasonably tight shots. Now, it's not as extreme as something like the 10x lens that you get on the S23 Ultra, but I think where the 15 Pro Max shines compared to that one is with its aperture. What you get with the iPhone is shallower depth of field and better low light performance. But where you really see the benefits of all of these lenses is in video, especially with the addition of ProRes log, which means not only do you have the high quality video recording that comes with ProRes, but you also have a flat picture profile, which is nice for maximizing your dynamic range, especially when you start color grading in applications like Final Cut Pro or DaVinci Resolve. Having more control over your color and exposure works wonders, especially in high contrast scenarios. There were plenty of times when I was shooting over the weekend when there was harsh sunlight, especially on my face, where I needed to rein that down, and ProRes log absolutely helped with that. Plus, if you plug in an external SSD or SD card over USB-C, you're able to shoot ProRes in 4K 60 as well. For someone that shoots 30p like myself, this means that you can get 2x slow-mo. Combine that with log, and the video looks so cinematic and good. Okay, so I've talked about the design, the action button, USB-C, the cameras. Now, I want to talk about some of the long-term concerns that I have using the iPhone 15 Pro Max, at least from what I could gather after using it for a weekend. The first big long-term concern I have with my iPhone 15 Pro Max is honestly the durability. Now, I know that a lot of people will probably use a case with these devices, but I do have some questions about how well the titanium will hold up long term. For the first couple of days of using a device, I don't use a case, and I'm kind of regretting that because I did actually drop this onto concrete about a 1.5 feet off the ground, which didn't really do serious damage, but I do have some pits and luckily no dents, but you definitely have a scratch here and there from the drop. But I think I especially have concerns about the darker colors of these phones. It really is just a thin layer of whatever they use to color the metal. But otherwise, when you drop it, it just exposes the real color of the titanium, which could stand out more than something like the natural titanium, which has a lighter shade and can hide those pits a little better. Of course, I can't really talk about durability without mentioning that jerry-rig everything video that's making its rounds all over the internet. And I think it really goes to show that the 15 Pro is honestly not as durable as we'd like to think it is, but maybe that's something for Apple to improve for the iPhone 16 and 16 Pro. So for now, don't deliberately try to bend your phone in half. It's not a Z Flip. Please don't do that. The battery life on the iPhone 15 Pro Max has honestly been fine for me, especially considering how much raw stills and ProRes video I've been shooting and with all of the USB devices attached to it. But something that I have more concerns about long term has to be with the thermals and performance. I haven't done any benchmarks or gaming on this thing, though I have been doing a lot of post-production for video and stills on this guy, and it does get pretty toasty. To be fair, most of the time I've been using this has been in bright sun in the middle of hot days, so not really the best way to get a gauge of how this will really perform in the real world, even though I was using it in the real world. A little more extreme than normal. Also, compared to my 14 Pro Max, this phone gets so hot to the point where it'll actually throttle down screen brightness way sooner than I think that 14 Pro Max would, which is kind of unfortunate because that's what I loved about the 14 Pro compared to the 13 that came before it, which was really bad. So all of this to say, I want to spend the next couple of weeks to actually properly test this out in my normal working conditions to see how well or not well it actually does. We'll just have to wait and see. Overall, for my first impressions, I like this iPhone 15 Pro Max. Is it perfect? Not even close. But I do think that the minor upgrades they made here do make for solid improvements. I like the cameras a lot, the action button's cool, would love to see a bit more functionality with that and some flexibility. Also, the USB-C port is a welcome addition, finally, especially for us pros. But I do think that Apple can work with the thermals, and I again want to see how this will perform in the long term once I get it under normal circumstances. But let me know, what do you think about the iPhone 15 Pro and Pro Max in the comments below? And otherwise, thanks for watching this video on Denki channel. Right as all of the horns come in.